The moment I opened that door and saw my daughter standing on my porch after 12 years of silence, I said, "Come in," just like that. And the look on her face, like she couldn't believe it was that easy, told me everything I needed to know. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand what those 12 years actually looked like. My name is Roberta. I turned 64 last March, and I spent my birthday the same way I'd spent most of the previous decade, alone in my kitchen in Charlotte, North Carolina, drinking coffee and watching the Cardinals fight over my backyard feeder. Some people would call that lonely. I called it peace. Hard-earned, deliberately chosen peace. I was a registered nurse for 31 years, spent the last 15 of my career in the cardiac ICU at Atrium Health, and if you've ever worked a unit like that, you know it teaches you things about people that no amount of living ordinary life ever could. You learn that humans are remarkably resilient. You learn that love is more complicated than anyone wants to admit. And you learn that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the very ones you need protecting from. My husband Gerald passed in the fall of 2010. Pancreatic cancer. 61 days from diagnosis to the morning I held his hand while the monitor went flat. He was 58 years old and the kindest man I have ever known. We had 40 years together, 32 of them, good in the deep down way that matters, and I won't sit here and pretend the last 8 weren't difficult. Gerald had his struggles, we had ours. But when he died, I felt like the floor had been pulled out from under me. I was 52 years old, and I didn't know what to do with myself. My daughter Simone was 27 then. She drove down from Atlanta for the funeral, and I was grateful for that. What I was not grateful for was the man she brought with her. His name was Daryl. She'd been with him about a year and a half at that point, and I'd met him exactly once before, at a family dinner where he spent most of the evening talking about himself and most of the rest of it on his phone. I didn't say anything at the time because Simone seemed happy, and I had learned by then that the fastest way to push a grown child towards someone is to tell them you don't like that person. So I kept my mouth shut. I smiled at Daryl. I passed him the cornbread. But at Gerald's funeral, something shifted. Daryl had opinions about everything, the flowers I'd chosen, the minister's eulogy, the reception at the church hall afterward. He pulled Simone aside at least 3 times during the service, and each time she came back looking smaller, more apologetic, more careful with me. By the end of the day, the warmth between us had cooled in a way I couldn't quite name, but could absolutely feel. 3 weeks later, Simone called me and said she thought I had been emotionally manipulative during the grief process, and that she needed space to figure out her relationship without my interference. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after she hung up, trying to find the moment where I had interfered. I couldn't find it. I still can't. The calls became fewer. Then they stopped. I sent birthday cards for 3 years. Simone acknowledged the first 2 with a text. The third came back unopened. I drove to Atlanta once in 2014 and knocked on the door of the house I knew was hers from Christmas cards she'd sent before the silence set in fully. Daryl answered. He looked at me the way you look at a stranger who has knocked on the wrong door and said Simone wasn't available. I asked him to tell her I'd come. He said he would. She never called. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I handled all of that gracefully. I cried. I went through a period where I called my sister Marguerite every single night and talked in circles until she finally, gently, told me that I had to stop waiting for Simone to come back and start building a life for myself. You have to live, Roberta, she said. You have to actually live. Roberta, she said. You have to actually live. So I did. I took early retirement at 61. I sold the house Gerald and I had owned for 22 years, big colonial on a cul-de-sac that had felt like a mausoleum since he died, and I bought a smaller place about 40 minutes outside Charlotte. Quiet neighborhood, good neighbors, a back porch that faces a stand of pines and a yard I actually tend to now. I started a garden. I joined a book club. I took a watercolor class at the community center and found out I was absolutely terrible at it, which made me laugh so hard I signed up for a second session. I was not happy in the way I had been happy with Gerald, but I was okay. Better than okay some days. I had rebuilt something, and it was mine. I also had a financial advisor named Cynthia who had been helping me manage Gerald's life insurance payout and the proceeds from the house sale. Over time, between conservative investments, a small inheritance from my own mother, and the fact that I had always been careful with money the way people who grew up without much always tend to be, I had accumulated more than most people would guess from looking at me. Nothing extravagant, nothing that would make the news, but enough. Enough that I could live well and still leave something behind. I hadn't told Simone any of this. She hadn't spoken to me in 12 years. There was nothing to tell. Then one evening in late September, I came home from the book club to find a car I didn't recognize in my driveway. A silver Audi, maybe 3 or 4 years old, with Georgia plates. I sat in my own car for a moment just looking at it. My heart was doing something complicated. I already knew. Simone was standing on my porch. She looked, and this is going to sound strange, she looked expensive. New clothes, good highlights, a handbag that cost more than my first car. She also looked nervous in a way that all that expense couldn't hide. When I got out of my car, she smiled, and it was the smile of someone who has practiced it. "Mama," she said. I hadn't heard that word in 12 years. Something moved through my chest. I let it move. "Simone," I said. She asked if she could come in. I said yes. Because here is the thing about me. I may be 64 years old. I may be living alone in a house outside Charlotte with a garden and a watercolor class I'm failing at. But I did not spend 31 years in cardiac care without learning how to hold myself very still when something important is happening. I wanted to understand what this was. So I opened the door and I let her in. She sat at my kitchen table and looked around and said she liked what I'd done with the place. I put on coffee. She talked about the drive down, the traffic on I-85, how the leaves were starting to turn. Small talk, surface talk, the talk of someone who is trying to find the on-ramp to a harder conversation. I let her find her way to it. Eventually, she said that she had been thinking about me a lot, that she missed me, that she was sorry for how long she'd let things go. I nodded. I handed her a mug. I waited. Then she said that she and Daryl were going through a difficult stretch. Nothing specific. Just a hard season, she said. They were thinking about some changes, maybe downsizing, maybe a fresh start, and she had been wondering whether I might have room for them to stay with me for a little while, just until they got back on their feet. There it was. I looked at my daughter's face. I love Simone. I want to be clear about that. Whatever she has done, whatever Daryl has done, she is my child. And I love her in that bottomless way that doesn't actually have a logical explanation and doesn't require one. But love and wisdom are not the same thing. And in that moment, they were telling me two very different things. I said I would need to think about it. I said I was glad she'd come. I asked if she was hungry. She ate 2 bowls of the chicken soup I had made that morning, and when she left 2 hours later, she hugged me on the porch in the dark. And it was a real hug, the kind from her childhood, and I stood there and held her and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything safe to say yet. After her taillights disappeared down the road, I went inside and called Cynthia. Then I called my nephew who works in corporate law in Raleigh. His name is Terence, and he is one of the sharpest people I know, and also one of the most discreet. I explained the situation. I told them both that I wasn't sure what was happening, but that 12 years of silence followed by a request to move in felt like something I needed to understand before I responded to. Terence said he could make some calls. Cynthia said she'd make sure all my accounts had extra verification in place. Neither of them told me I was being paranoid. That meant a lot. What Terence found out over the following 2 weeks was not what I had expected. It was worse. Daryl had been in serious financial trouble for at least 3 years. A business he'd started in 2019 had failed and left significant debt. He and Simone had refinanced their Atlanta home twice and were close to defaulting. He had also, according to one of Terence's contacts who knew someone in their social circle, been talking to a financial attorney about asset protection, specifically about whether marital assets could be shielded if a spouse received a gift or inheritance. I read that part of Terence's email twice. Then I read it a third time. They hadn't come because Simone missed me. Daryl had sent her. He knew, I don't know how, perhaps through old family connections, perhaps through simple digging, that I had money. And he had calculated that 12 years of estrangement and a mother's hunger for her child were leverage he could use. I sat with that for a full day before I decided what to do. I cried some of it. I was angry for a lot of it. But by the time the sun went down on that second day, I was clear. I called Simone and told her that yes, she and Daryl were welcome to stay. A short-term arrangement, I said, while they got things sorted. She sounded genuinely relieved, and I wondered how much of that relief was real, and how much was Daryl's plan coming together. I told myself it didn't matter right now. I told myself to focus. They arrived on a Friday evening in October. Daryl was warm in the practiced way of people who are performing warmth. He complimented the house, carried in their bags, called me Miss Roberta in a tone that managed to be both respectful and slightly patronizing. I watched him move through my home and I kept my face pleasant and my eyes open. Simone was different in his presence than she'd been alone with me 2 weeks earlier. Smaller again, more careful. She checked his reactions before she finished her sentences. It broke my heart to watch, and I didn't let it show. The first week was quiet. I was working, doing some consulting for a home health agency, a few hours a week, enough to stay sharp, and when I came home in the evenings, Daryl always seemed to be on his phone, pacing the back porch, talking in a low voice. He asked me very casually early in the second week whether I had a financial advisor. I said yes. He asked who. I gave him a name, not Cynthia's real name, a name I had prepared for exactly this question. He said he had a friend in wealth management who was exceptional if I was ever looking to restructure anything. I said I'd keep that in mind. That night I texted Terence. He's moving. The following Saturday, Daryl asked if the three of us could sit down together and talk. He said he had some ideas he wanted to share. Something about helping me make the most of what I had, as if he knew what I had, which of course was exactly the point. He brought papers, printed pages, glossy, the kind of thing that looks official but that a good attorney would spot as boilerplate in about 45 seconds. He talked about a family investment trust. He talked about tax efficiency. He talked about protecting generational wealth. He slid a document across the table toward me. I looked at it. I looked at him. I looked at my daughter, who was looking at the table. And I said, Daryl, I'm going to need to have my attorney look at anything before I sign. He smiled, said of course absolutely that was the smart thing to do. Very reasonable. The smile didn't reach his eyes. I had already sent Terence photographs of those documents 4 days earlier, because Daryl had left them in a folder in the guest room, and I had gone in to change the towels, and I had read every page, and I had taken out my phone, and I had photographed every single one. Terence had consulted with a colleague who specialized in elder financial fraud. What Daryl was proposing would have given him, through a series of steps that were obscured by legal-sounding language, effective control over a significant portion of my assets. If I had signed and then died, or even if I had simply become incapacitated, the money would have flowed in a direction that had nothing to do with my wishes. It was fraud. It was also, depending on which statutes applied, potentially elder financial exploitation, which in North Carolina is a felony. I did not let any of this show at the kitchen table. I said I'd have Terence take a look. Daryl said, great. We finished our coffee. 3 days later, Terence called me to say that a detective with the Financial Crimes Unit had reviewed the documents and agreed that there was enough to move forward. They wanted to handle it carefully. They wanted to make sure Daryl didn't destroy anything or disappear before they were ready. I agreed to let them set the pace. I went back to tending my garden and making my chicken soup and sitting on my back porch and watching the cardinals. I did not tell Simone. I have asked myself 100 times whether that was right. I still don't have a clean answer, but I have to believe that Daryl had enough of a hold on her that warning her would have warned him, and everything would have dissolved. She would have left. He would have covered his tracks, and nothing would have been resolved. So I waited, and I watched. And on a Tuesday evening in November, when Daryl came home from what he said was a lunch meeting, there were 2 detectives in my living room. I will not pretend I felt nothing watching that. I felt too much. I felt grief for the version of events where none of this had ever happened. I felt relief that it was over. I felt rage, quiet and specific, at a man who had used my daughter's love for me as a tool. And underneath all of it, the constant low frequency of a mother's love that does not have the decency to turn itself off even when it would be convenient. Daryl was arrested. The charges included financial fraud and attempted elder exploitation. He was taken out of my house in handcuffs while Simone stood in the hallway with her hand over her mouth. After the detectives left, we sat at the kitchen table for a long time without speaking. I made tea because it gave me something to do with my hands. Outside, the sky was doing that thing it does in November when the light goes early and everything turns a particular shade of grey-blue that I've always found beautiful and sad in equal measure. Simone said, "How long did you know?" I said, "Long enough." She asked why I hadn't told her. I took a breath and I told her the truth, that I wasn't sure she would have believed me and that I couldn't risk her warning him before the evidence was secured. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You're right. I don't know what I would have done." And the way she said it, like a door finally opening, like 12 years of carefully maintained distance starting to crack, I recognized it. I had waited a long time for that sound. We talked for 4 hours that night. We talked about Gerald and about the funeral and about the months after, when Daryl had slowly and systematically convinced Simone that I had been controlling, that I had never approved of her choices, that her grief was really anger at me, and that distance was the healthy choice. Simone said she had believed him because she was in pain and he was there, and sometimes what we need most is for someone to give us a reason. I understood that. I told her I understood that. I also told her that understanding didn't mean we were starting over with a clean slate. That wasn't how it worked. 12 years was 12 years. It was her father's last years, and the days after, and birthdays and Christmases and every ordinary Tuesday that adds up to a life. She couldn't give me those back, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. What I said was this: I am your mother. That doesn't expire. But I am also a person who has spent 12 years learning to live without you, and I need you to understand that the relationship we build from here, if we build one, has to be built on honesty, on respect, and on the understanding that I am not a resource. I am a person. She cried. I let her cry. I handed her a napkin. She said, "I know that, Mama." I said, "I know you know it now." Daryl's case moved through the courts over the following months. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of attempted financial fraud and received a suspended sentence with 5 years of probation and a permanent restraining order, keeping him away from me. His attorney argued that the harm had been limited because no documents were actually signed. The court agreed that I had been protected. I found I didn't feel particularly triumphant about any of it. I felt tired, and I felt glad, and I felt ready to move on. Simone filed for divorce in January. She moved to a small apartment in Raleigh, closer to Terence, which I think she found comforting. She got a job with a marketing firm. She calls me on Sunday mornings, usually around 10, and we talk for 30 or 40 minutes about books and work and the garden and whatever is on her mind. She drove down in March and helped me plant the spring bulbs. It was a cold afternoon, and we both wore too many layers, and she laughed at something I said. And for a moment I forgot entirely about the 12 years, and then I remembered, and both things were true at the same time. That's where we are. It's not a fairy tale. There are still days when I feel the weight of what was lost, when I look at a photograph from Simone's graduation or her childhood, or some ordinary Sunday, and I feel the specific grief of time that cannot be recovered. There are still moments between us that are a little careful, a little tender in the way that new skin over an old wound is tender. I suspect there always will be. But she is my daughter, and I am her mother. And we are, carefully, with open eyes and no illusions about what we are building or what it costs, finding our way back to each other. On the Sunday after Easter, Simone came to stay for the weekend. She brought coffee from a place in Raleigh she told me about, the good kind, and we sat on my back porch in the April morning light with our mugs and watched the cardinals at the feeder. She asked me how I was really doing. I told her the truth, which was that I was good, not performing good, actually good. She put her hand over mine on the armrest of the chair. I let it stay there. I think about that October evening a lot, the silver Audi in my driveway, my heart doing something complicated before I even got out of the car. I already knew. Some part of me knew before Simone said a single word, and yet I opened the door anyway. Not because I was naive, because I had spent 31 years reading people in high-stakes rooms, and I knew the difference between the truth and a performance, and I needed to see which one I was dealing with. What Daryl didn't understand, what people like him rarely understand, is that cruelty has a way of returning to the person who sends it out. Not because the universe is keeping score in some mystical ledger, but because the choices we make shape who we become, and who we become determines what we attract and what we lose. Daryl spent years quietly dismantling my relationship with my daughter, convincing her that her mother was the problem, all while positioning himself as the solution. And then, when his own house of cards collapsed, he came looking for the person he had worked so hard to isolate. That is not bad luck. That is the natural end of a road that was always going to lead somewhere dark. I made my own choices too, and I want to be honest about that. I could have confronted Simone years earlier. I could have shown up in Atlanta and refused to leave until she talked to me. I chose not to, partly out of respect for her autonomy, and partly, I'll admit, out of pride. And those 12 years cost me things I will never get back. Actions have weight. Inaction has weight. Everything lands somewhere. What I'm most proud of, and this took me a long time to say without embarrassment, is that I did not let grief make me foolish. When Simone appeared on my porch, every part of me that had been waiting 12 years wanted to throw the door open and ask no questions. But I had built something in those years of solitude, not just financial security, though that mattered. I had built the kind of clear-eyed self-knowledge that comes from spending a lot of time alone with yourself and not looking away. I knew what I was worth. I knew what I deserved. And I knew that love, real love, the durable kind, does not require you to hand someone a weapon and ask them not to use it. That clarity, I think, is something that has to be earned. You earn it by staying in hard situations long enough to understand them rather than just escape them. You earn it by asking honest questions about your own role in things. Simone had let herself be led because she was in pain, and Daryl was there with ready answers. I understood that. Understanding it didn't mean excusing it, but it meant I could sit across the table from my daughter and speak to her like a human being instead of an adversary. That mattered for what came after. We are rebuilding, Simone and I, slowly, carefully, with the particular tenderness of people who know exactly how fragile things can be. She calls on Sunday mornings. She helped me plant bulbs in March. There are still moments between us that are a little careful. I don't think that ever fully goes away, and I have made my peace with that. What I know is that the relationship we have now is built on something real, on two women who see each other clearly and choose each other anyway. That is rarer and more valuable than anything Daryl ever could have taken from me.